organization that was interested in it.
I feel like that's like very cool. Like,
Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for coming. I am told that we have over 100 people registered, so I assume most of them are online. It's always like that. 100 people register, and then the day comes and they all get lazy and watch it online. So, but that's more food for you guys out there. So that's a good thing. We have an interesting discussion today about Sudan, which is Sudan has been in the news for a while, and now it's reaching really a critical situation. I mean, now it is literally starvation that's going on as a result of the civil war that's been still going. We have some very distinguished speakers. Chief among them is Ambassador Donald Booth, who was the U.S. Special Envoy on Sudan and South Sudan. He was a presidential special envoy. So, as you know, the United States has different special envoys, I guess, depending. Then we have two guests who are joining us remotely. We have Dr. Nada Fadul, who is a medical doctor, and she is assistant dean at the University of Nebraska Medical School, who is also originally from Sudan. So she will be joining us. And then we have Fadi, the last name, Abi Lamona. Yeah. He's a regional advisor at the UNDP, the United Nations Development Program in New York, responsible for Sudan, Somalia, Djibouti, and Yemen, who is also, you can see him on the screen. What is Dr. Fadul, by the way? Is she joining us?
yes,
She's online.
I'm here.
She's on.
Okay. Okay, so the program is very simple. We're going to start with the ambassador, who will give us some thoughts on the situation in Sudan and what's going on and how the United States and the international community needs to engage with it at this stage. Then we'll go on to Dr. Nada, and then to Fadi. And then we'll open it up for discussion and question Q&A. Ambassador, thank you for being here. You have the floor. Please share with us your thoughts on what's going on in Sudan and how the U.S. needs to engage with that.
Thank you very much, Hafiz. Am I online? Okay. So it's a pleasure to be here today with you, ladies and gentlemen, to discuss navigating Sudan's challenges, peace transition, and humanitarian response. We all know that Sudan is facing a catastrophe now. It's a man-made catastrophe. We've seen the figures since the conflict began a year ago. 8 to 9 million people have been displaced. 2 million of them are refugees in neighboring countries. Roughly a third of the population is facing acute hunger, of which I understand perhaps several 100,000 could be facing starvation in the very near future because humanitarian assistance has been hindered by both the warring parties. And of course, you have the 15 to 20,000 or more who have already been killed, the sexual violence, the ethnic violence that has accompanied. So this is a complex crisis. It is not two generals fighting it out for who's going to be number one in the country. It has its roots in Sudan's colonial boundaries, which put together a vast array of different ethnic groups, different religions, and the political class of Sudan has failed since independence to come up with a formula that would embrace this diversity and would enable the Sudanese to live peacefully with each other. The other factor going back quite a ways is the fact that at independence, Sudan was already facing a rebellion in the south. And so of all the institutions of the new country, it was the military which immediately had to defend the state and therefore had a greater claim on state resources. And it became the preeminent institution in the state. And as a preeminent institution, it played a political role, multiple coups, of course, long periods of governance, but it also wormed its way into the economy to the point where it has a dominant role in the economy of Sudan as well. And then there are roots in the Bashir era, and two critical things in that regard. One was Bashir, in order to maintain himself in power, didn't want to have just one military force because they might turn against him. So he created multiple ones, and the RSF was among them. There's also the National Security Service and others. But as we now know, the RSF came out of that era. It was also used to fight wars in the periphery, rather than sending the main army. So that's one issue. The other is that the Islamization of the state and of the Sudan armed forces occurred during the Bashir era. The coup of 1989, which Bashir led, was actually a coup basically to bring the Muslim Brotherhood into power. So you have the 2018 revolution. I'm skipping a lot of history here, obviously. It was led by civilians, basically younger people and women who took to the streets in massive numbers. And by April of 2019, it started in December of 2018, by April of 2019, the security chiefs, with the exception perhaps of Salagosha and this, decided that it was Bashir was more of a liability than an asset, and so they overthrew him. And their intention was to form a military government and just kind of revise the deck chairs a bit. The civilians didn't have any truck for that, and so they occupied the square in front of Army headquarters for the better part of 2 months until the massacre of June 3rd, 2019. And I think the generals at that point and their regional backers thought, okay, this is over, and we're telling me, who I just come back as envoy for the second time, that things will settle down in Sudan. But on June 30th, there was another massive outpouring of civilian protests. And at that point, I think that convinced the generals and their regional backers that they had to have some accommodation. And so within a month, you had the political declaration and the constitutional declaration. A month later, the formation of the transitional government. Now, that transitional government was a three-legged stool, and three legs is usually fairly stable. The civilians, really, it was important that there be two military groups, again, so that just one of them could move against them. So they could make, hopefully, some alliances that give greater stability to what the civilians were trying to accomplish. And both armed groups, the RSF and the SAF, needed the civilians in order to maintain stability and quiet in the country. So that worked for a while. But the civilians wanted to do things like look at the economic interests of the military, and in particular the economic interests of the former regime. And they began really to seriously look at clawing back some of those economic assets. And that, I think, was the reason that the generals, both Hemeti and Burhan, Hemeti the RSF, Burhan of the SAF, the Sudan Armed Forces, decided to stage the coup in October of 2021. I think the other factor was that by that time, the old NCP cadres had sort of regrouped sufficiently that they basically encouraged the Sudan Armed Forces to move against the civilian government. This is a conflict that's essential, really an essential fight over Sudan's future. The SAF and their Islamist backers, they really want to return to some sort of Bashir era regime, obviously without Bashir, an Islamization of the state, and a dominance of the center of the Nile Valley ethnic groups over the periphery. The RSF, in particular Hemeti, I say Hemeti because it's hard to know exactly what the RSF as an institution would want. But Hemeti, as their leader, I think would like to have some sort of political structure. He's happy with a civilian transition. I think he'd even be happy with civilian governance in the country, as long as he can take his uniform off and become a civilian and play a dominant, if not the dominant role going forward. And the civilians, both the professional political class, civil society, the grassroots, they're all looking for civilian governance, a democratic system, but most of them are opposed to sort of a continued major role for Islam in the state. So how does this conflict get resolved? Some people say that the only way to resolve a conflict like that is military victory. And you can point to, for example, the Biafra rebellion in Nigeria in the early 60s, that it was a decisive victory over the rebels that had won and has kept Nigeria unified. Sudan's history does not give me any confidence that there could be a military victory. The Sudan Armed Forces never won any of the civil conflicts that the state has engaged in since independence. They all ended by some sort of negotiation. And even if they were to win some sort of nominal victory, would that really solve things? Or would there not be further rebellions in the periphery, as we've seen in the south, in Darfur, in South Kordofan, etc. So the state is really de facto divided. It's fracturing at this point. Areas controlled by the RSF, areas controlled by the SAF, areas controlled by the SPLM North, by Abdul-Wahid and the Sudan Liberation Army in Darfur, by some of the other groups that signed the Darfur Peace Agreement. It's fracturing. People are taking sides. I think some are obviously committed to one side or the other. Some, I think, are trying to be on the winning side and may very well switch sides in the future. So what next? You mentioned starvation, famine, looming. This is one thing that I can't see being in anybody's interest, not in any of the generals' interests, not in, frankly, any of the regional or international players' interests either. That brings, I mean, frankly, too much attention, doesn't advance anybody's objectives in Sudan. So what is needed to prevent famine? Obviously, focus on getting humanitarian aid in the country. And I think this notion that you somehow have to get permission from the military government in Port Sudan to cross the border from Chad is ridiculous. The important thing is getting aid to the people. And so I think the UN and others need to take a little more risk in hand and deal with people who control an area to deliver aid to that area. We had during the long second Anyanya on the Southern Rebellion, we had Operation Lifeline Sudan, which there was no peace agreement, but there was aid brought in despite the fact of lack of a ceasefire. This war has not been regionalized like the Congo was in 1998, when external factor armies actually got themselves involved in the conflict. But it certainly has had major impact on the region. You think of the strain that Chad is under, hosting 1 million refugees, South Sudan in particular, which with one of the two pipelines cut off, it's lost 75% of its oil export earning capacity, and oil exports for South Sudan are 90% of its revenue. So this is a major hit for South Sudan. So what's really needed is international cooperation to restore peace in Sudan. So what ideas do I have for this? Well, I have a couple. One, I think it's important to convene first the external actors. I know this may not sit well after all of the Sudanese conflict, and Sudanese need to be at the center of solving it. But I think until the external actors can sort out what their conflicting interests are, that it's going to be hard for the Sudanese to start to sort out the conflict themselves. Perhaps you need to start with a small group of the external actors, perhaps those who have been talked about being added to the Jeddah process, the talks that have been held sporadically in Jeddah since the conflict began, and then expand it to others, because the number of actors supporting one side or the other continues to expand. I think another thing that needs to be undertaken now is a really serious discussion among Sudanese, particularly among the Sudanese, about accountability. There are all these calls for accountability for atrocities, for war crimes. But what general is going to agree to a ceasefire and then turn himself over to the ICC the next day? Accountability has to be a Sudanese issue. It has to be something Sudanese will be satisfied with, but it has to be something that also will contribute to moving forward toward peace. And then third, there needs to be a very serious discussion that has to start now about security sector reform. And it needs to be inclusive of all or as many armed groups as possible. Because everyone agrees that Sudan needs one army, but now it has a plethora of armies. It's not just the Sudan Armed Forces and the Rapid Support Forces. There are the armed Darfuri groups. There's the SPLM North, and there are the Popular Front. There are all sorts of armed groups that are formed, and that has begun again to proliferate during the current conflict. What are some of the stumbling blocks? Just to mention a couple, one are the external spoilers. And while you have many external actors who are playing a role in Sudan and fueling the conflict to some extent, or to a great extent, there are also others that are involved who may, frankly, not be unhappy if the conflict continues, that their prospects of achieving their objectives are improved by the conflict continuing, by instability in Sudan. So another is which Sudanese parties to include. And here you have a fundamental difference. The Sudan Forces, General Bashir, General Burhan, wants this to be, quote, inclusive, which sounds good, but inclusive means including the National Congress Party holdovers. Those holdovers from Bashir are Muslim brothers. This is anathema to most of the rest of the civilians. It's clearly anathema to Hemeti, who sees that they will take their revenge against him for turning against them back in 2019. So this is a fundamental issue. How do you deal with this? If you bring them into peace negotiations, do they become a spoiler? If you keep them out, are they a spoiler? So perhaps you can finesse this by not having them in the peace negotiations, but giving them assurances that they can partake in governance going forward in Sudan, where they can have a role. They would not be excluded. Just an idea. Don't know. And then finally, this question of reconstruction. It's going to take a generation, at least, to rebuild Sudan. The education system has been destroyed. The health system has been destroyed. So many people in the urban areas have lost everything. The farming output has declined drastically because there's no way to move around the goods you need, the seeds, the fertilizer, etc. So really everything needs to be rebuilt. But rebuilding, which I know from my experience in Liberia in the early 2000s, is a very lengthy process and it takes a lot of help from the outside. And Sudan is going to face stiff competition because hopefully we'll also be rebuilding Gaza and rebuilding Ukraine at the same time. So the prognosis for Sudan, there are a lot of hurdles, a lot of stumbling blocks, but I think there are international partners, and I think the United States is one of them, that really wants to see the humanitarian crisis alleviated and the fighting brought to an end, and the civilians who have been trying to express the idea of a new Sudan. I know that's a John Garang thing, but it is a new Sudan that the vast majority of Sudanese want. And I say this because I was in Khartoum on August 17th, 2019, when the Constitutional Declaration was signed. But that evening, I went down to Freedom Square, and I was among at least 1 million young Sudanese on the streets celebrating that finally they had some civilian governance. I think this is what the youth of Sudan want, and they are the majority of the population. And one can hope that they will be able to prevail with our support. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ambassador. I can honestly tell you, and that if you move the word Sudan from everything you said, including the external actors, the different militias or military forces within this conflict with between the different parties, and just put Libya, it is an exact picture. I mean, I'm not even talking about similar, I'm talking exact. And this is where the situation today, the only difference is that Libya, because of its oil revenues, is not starving. The starvation hasn't happened. And I can honestly tell you that involving the external, what we call the external actors in a polite diplomatic way, is a major problem. I mean, there's one power, for example, and you're not going to agree with me publicly, but I know you do. The UAE has been the major spoiler both in Libya and in Sudan. The military equipment is coming from their alliances in Libya through down into Sudan and Hemeti. They have been financing most of these chaos. They also, in the case of Libya, love the idea that things are still chaotic because that's what really gets their interest going. And the problem with that is that it's also the Russians that are coming through that corridor all the way to Sudan. And for some odd reason that I still cannot understand, our government here in Washington has never been serious about telling Abu Dhabi to just stop it. And we accommodate them in ways that are, I think, very troubling. Anyway, let's move on to our next speaker, Dr. Nada. Please, thank you very much for joining us. We're honored to have you. We were hoping you're going to be here in person in Washington, but we're going to settle with just seeing you on the screen. Please go ahead and give us your sense of what's going on and a basis for our discussion later on.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. And it's really my pleasure to be among this amazing panel and the group today. I wish I was there in person as well. So, I mean, I think Ambassador Booth already kind of laid the background of what I was going to talk about, which is that the situation in Sudan right now, the humanitarian situation, is beyond catastrophic. And I wish there was another word. I've been using catastrophic for the past few months. I don't know if it's perhaps apocalyptic at this stage, because half of the population of Sudan are in need of humanitarian assistance. And this includes 90% of the refugees being women and children, refugees and internally displaced people. And just in the past 2 weeks, over 100,000 people have been displaced from the region. So this is an active conflict that's leading to active displacement on a weekly basis. And according to some sources from the resistance committees in South Omdurman, just this past week, 4 people have died due to hunger in that small locality of Umbadda in Omdurman. So the situation is really just unbearable on the ground for those people who have to bear the burden of this war. The UN has asked for about 2.7 billion in humanitarian assistance, and there was only 10% of that has been met by pledges. But the Paris Convention that occurred a couple of weeks ago actually offers some hope that maybe we will be able to meet the humanitarian needs of the people in Sudan. The challenge, though, as Ambassador Booth mentioned, is getting that humanitarian assistance to people who need it on the ground. And again, I wanted to emphasize the fact that we're talking mostly about women, children, many pregnant women, including about 230,000 children and pregnant women who are facing acute hunger right now in displacement camps across Sudan, according to Save the Children. And, even though the international response has not really kept with the crisis in Sudan, partly due to the fact that there are the conditions on the ground, the infrastructure of humanitarian assistance was eroded a long time ago, but also because of the competing demands and priorities, to be frankly, in the world right now. Sudan does not rank on the top of the list when it comes to US or other international community priorities, unfortunately, due to many factors. But right now we're dealing with the Ukraine, we're dealing with the Gaza crisis that sometimes put this in the back burner. And there have been a lot of reports describing this as a forgotten war or the neglected war, which did not receive the due attention that it deserves. So even with that, there have been a lot of efforts from the international community to try to reach people in need. And since January of this year, about 2.3 million people have been reached with humanitarian assistance. But this is with a lot of hurdles, a lot of obstacles. And part of them are actually due to the warring parties themselves, hindering humanitarian assistance, creating issues with safe passages so that humanitarian actors are not able to reach what they need to reach. Early on during the war, actually, a few humanitarian workers were killed by the warring parties. And that creates another level of concern for humanitarian agencies. And the other major issue, in my opinion, honestly, is that the system in Sudan before the war was not very conducive to this level of disaster, to respond to this level of disaster. There was no infrastructure for health or public health or education. Resources and agencies were centralized in Khartoum, and Khartoum was the first part to fall for this war. So that led to complete chaos because all the humanitarian agencies and supplies were actually centralized in Khartoum. The rest of Sudan was not really built to handle this level of disaster. The other issue that I think was is quite an issue is this interdependence of humanitarian assistance and ceasefire for humanitarian assistance on the other larger issue of peace and security negotiation. And the two warring parties are using this as a bargain chip. Each of them is using it to their advantage, either to try to elevate their status or create more barriers or make the other party look that are responsible for these issues. And that left the poor Sudanese people in the middle of this, having to try to figure out how are they going to provide for themselves in the midst of this disaster. So there's so many issues here. The situation is extremely complex, but I would like to just offer some, it's hard for me to call it hope, honestly, but I would like to offer some solutions that could be entertained, especially in the next stage. If that humanitarian assistance is pledged, how can we effectively actually get it to the ground and get it to people who need it in the midst of this chaos? I think the first thing that the international actors need to emphasize during peace negotiation, during whatever intervention, as Ambassador Booth suggested, is that the issue of humanitarian assistance and response to the humanitarian crisis really needs to be separated completely from the peace negotiation. It cannot be put on that agenda because we know how that's going to end. It's been a year already, and we have seen very little movement in that area. And it's going to be hard to move the needle because the peace negotiations between these two parties are going to be very rocky, and the road is going to be very tortuous to reach peace. And the way it is right now, I don't really see that we're looking at that in the next year or two. So we really have to separate these two issues from each other, even though they're interlinked in so many ways, but the discussion of these has to be separated. And the other potential consideration is Sudan has a very long and rich history of society and community intervention, community mobilization during disaster. I think we all know how we got to the revolution, right? We got to the revolution because of mobilization of the community, the youth group, the women groups, the community-based resistance committees, service committees. And these were the first mobilizers after the war. They've been traditionally the first mobilizers during natural disaster, during flood seasons. But in this war specifically, the first mobilizers were those community-based organizations. And we tend to underestimate their ability. We tend to underestimate their potential. And the international agencies have not leveraged them to their full potential, in my opinion, because those are the people on the ground who can figure out how to get supplies to people, who can figure out how to, obtain supplies. Sometimes it's really hard to get supplies to areas like Darfur, for example, and those are areas facing acute hunger. But when you talk to youth groups on the ground, other society organizations on the ground, they're able to figure out how to get this type of assistance. So ways to effectively leverage these youth group or community-based organizations can go a long way, but they need to be, that needs to be done in very concerted effort. So we need to look at the multi-pronged strategy where international actors can provide guidance, tools, resources, and funding for these community organizations in order for them to deliver aid, especially to hard-to-reach areas. Finally, I think we also need to not underestimate the potential for this disaster to extend beyond the borders of Sudan. We've already seen, the impact of this disaster in neighboring countries, but I'm also very concerned about the potential of disease spread. Vaccine-preventable diseases are not going to be preventable anymore in the view of the humanitarian crisis that is happening. We've already seen emergence of things like measles, and we're going to be looking at things like mpox, and other preventable diseases spreading in the region and beyond the borders of Sudan. The outbreak of cholera in Red Sea area in Eastern Sudan was one of the largest in the world a few months ago. And we're looking at a flood season that's coming in very soon. And we anticipate that that's going to be another major outbreak. So I think when we look at the situation in Sudan, we shouldn't really isolate it to the borders of Sudan. We should think broadly about how this can impact the whole region. So I'll stop here in the interest of time and turn it over to you, and I'm happy to entertain questions later.
Thank you very, very much. Sharing your thoughts with us about the idea of like conflict that's neglected and it's not in the forefront of international interest. I've heard that about every conflict in the world. Everybody says that. In our part of the world, Dr. Nada, you know that the only way you get the United States interest or European interest is if you get the Russians and the Chinese involved. Then everybody wakes up. And I think that's happening beneath the surface, and unfortunately not too many people are paying attention to that. Okay, we'll have more to discuss, but let me go to Dr. Fadi to share his thoughts, and then we'll start having our discussion.
Thank you. Really, it's an absolute honor to be sharing this space with you. And I had hoped that I would be able to attend with you in person, but virtually is just as good. So, look, I'll take a few moments to really complement what my fellow panelists have said and try to make the case that, humanitarian aid alone, while a must, is not enough. I'll try to make the case why development in the context of this cycle of violence in Sudan is a necessity and not an option. So I'll go a bit further than what the ambassador mentioned in terms of just humanitarian aid per se. So the region is full of turmoil, and it's not the first crisis that Sudan has faced or other countries in the region have faced. And I think experiences have taught us a few things. One is that when you combine humanitarian development and peace building efforts together from the onset, they're more likelihood to meet the needs of the affected populations and sort of build their strength, resilience, and sort of their will to want peace. But our experiences have also sort of debunked prevailing wisdom in the sense that there's no sequence to this. It's not sort of we start just with the humanitarian, then do development, and then peace building. The three responses are more effective when carried out jointly, and this is what so many practitioners would call the nexus or the humanitarian development peace nexus approach. So while humanitarian aid, life-saving humanitarian assistance, and external peace interventions are important, they might be insufficient on their own to address some of the structural underlying causes of the crisis in Sudan, laid out very nicely by the ambassador. So for this, I'd like to use the results of our latest report, which we carried out in collaboration with IFPRI, which is the International Food Policy Research Institute, to certify that the purely humanitarian response, especially in a protracted crisis like the Sudan one is looking like, can lead to some implications, including dependency and even erosion of the human capital. So our study launched earlier this month looked at the livelihoods in rural areas of Sudan. So it's one in a series of studies that will be coming out, but the first one really looked at rural areas of Sudan. We surveyed almost 4,500 rural households, and the study is among the very few, if not the only study that managed to reach that number of households in rural Sudan. So just to share with you some key findings that could illustrate or make the case. Almost 59% of the household surveys face moderate to severe food insecurity. So that's just to sort of certify the previous messages that famine is what is expected in 2024. That's particularly in areas and states of Khartoum, Al Jazeera, Darfur, and the Kordofan regions. The study also shows that 71% of households do not own agriculture land, and half of those that reported owning agriculture land own just a little or few. 70% of respondents indicated that they did not cultivate any land during 2023 season. And half of the households that reported cultivating land indicated that their farming was naturally disrupted by the conflict. A quarter of the rural household surveys reported that they were not able to visit markets, and that's obvious for obviously reasons: physical barriers, economic limitations, safety issues, so on and so forth. But almost 50% were unable to make essential purchases, and most of them citing high prices as the primary barrier. So what does that mean on the big picture? Nationally, income has dropped at 60% for the sample household survey, and the large sum of them also reported complete income loss. The findings also showed that certain sectors were really impacted. In mining sector, almost 90% reported dramatic drop of their income in that sector. So in a nutshell, the problem is not only food availability, but also food affordability. Naturally, the conflict has exacerbated existing pre-war vulnerabilities, which were mentioned earlier, whether housing, access to services, infrastructure, so on and so forth. So, this disparity is also just growing in terms of access. So what can one deduct from the findings I just shared? Definitely, we have a food crisis, in that people are calling, rightly so, famine. And the straightforward and immediate solution is to, provide food, import food. However, I think this faces some problems. One, we will not be able to get it in the scale needed to feed all people, even if we manage to address the issue of access. And therefore, I think it's insufficient. The second is that we know from protracted crisis in neighboring countries that it will not be sustained for long, for reasons associated to costs, unfortunate competition over other crises, whether in Yemen, Ukraine, Gaza, so on and so forth. And really, the third one is a principle of if you continue just providing aid, you're just creating a norm of dependency on the long run. So again, just to be clear, this does not mean that food aid is not needed. It is needed, and it is needed immediately. However, what I'm trying to say is that alone, it might actually fall short. It will meet the immediate needs of a portion of the population, but we know that it won't be sustained just looking at examples in neighboring countries. From my side, as a practitioner in the development field, I would say that if we provide immediate food aid, coupled with two things, we might have better chances. One is connecting again to the study, revitalization of the agriculture sector where it is possible. We know that the conflict is not raging in all corners of Sudan, and subsidies can be provided, fertilizers, seeds, so on and so forth. If we do that, we would be able to help small farmers to continue to have the ability to produce their own food, and therefore, even partially, but we'd be able to try and address the question of availability. Second, supporting livelihood opportunities again in the agriculture sector to allow people to have the money to actually buy and purchase their own food would also partially be helping in addressing the problem of food affordability. And the same concept can be extrapolated to the larger infrastructure or services provision. We need to avoid creating a complete dependency when it comes to the provision of basic services like water, health, energy, so on. So the ambassador mentioned the institutional collapse, and rightly so. It is very important to keep the focus also on mitigating a complete institutional collapse. And it is just as important. So, for example, instead of relying on trucking in certain areas like Wadi Madani, for example, investing in solutions that would safeguard the continuation of local institutions to continue providing services is just as critical, not only for now, but for the day after. So this nexus approach that I tried to lay out, what does this approach also contribute? In my opinion, this approach also is critical to preserving the human capital. So we need to focus on preserving that human capital of Sudan. We want to maintain people's ability to serve themselves after the war. And rightly so, Dr. Nada mentioned groups that, they're remarkable, they're very resourceful. So by supporting neighborhood committees, resistance committees, and making sure that women's voices are at the forefront now in the provision and management of, even if they are makeshift services, they will have the know-how needed in the immediate aftermath of the war to reconstitute national capacities, whether they're working in the private sector or they're working with the government. In that sense, preserving the human capital now is critical for Sudan's future. So just to conclude, unfortunately, as I mentioned earlier, our region, crisis start and never end. I'm Lebanese. I feel like it's just one crisis after the other. Dr. Nada is Sudanese, and I'm sure among the audience there are colleagues and friends that are from the region and can associate with that. Unfortunately, Sudan seems to be on that path. A whole year has passed, and little signs point to fast, peaceful solutions. The will of the Sudanese to pursue and demand peace need to be supported. So while external actions are important, I think we still need to support those voices. We should hope that by expanding assistance to the Sudanese people beyond humanitarian aid to focus on sustainable development solutions, we would be preserving the Sudanese people's sense of agency. So we know voices are important, and some maybe among the audience right now will be saying, what about giving voice? Asking for democracy or elections right now, I think is important, but I think the sense of agency is as important, if not more important, for them to have decision for what they do with their lives. Agency is a critical piece to nurturing people's will to end the conflict and work toward it. And maybe I'll just conclude with a similar thought as the ambassador mentioned earlier. I think the images of young people, women, and men leading change on the streets of Sudan in 2019 is what should define the Sudanese and not the current suffering. Thank you.
Very much. Two things. The report that Fadi was talking about from the UNDP, our colleagues in the UNDP, will be sent to everybody who's registered for this forum. So you should get it by email, hopefully soon, right? Today. Lana will ensure that. Secondly, as Fadi sort of mentioned, because of the background some of us have from that part of the world, we see this repetitive pattern that is happening almost exactly the same in Sudan, in Libya, in even places like Chad and so on. My own focus on that region is I think that region needs to be looked at as a whole and dealt with as a whole, because I think what is common between them in terms of tribal, religious, historical affiliations and roots are almost the same. And that's why we see this repetitive thing. And the funny part is the international community and the United States, which used to be the leader of this, now it seems to take a second, repeat the same exact verbs, the same exact words, the same exact everything. But there are no really defined tools to achieve the objectives we talk about, the voice of women, the youth, negotiations, right? I can write it. The question is, how are we going to do it? How are we going to deliver it? And how are we going to stop the spoilers from that region? I'm going to just, out of deference to Arij Haj, a very distinguished journalist, Sudanese American, who has the famous program on Al-Hurra TV about Sudan. She sent me her questions. She is watching us. She couldn't come here, and she was actually the person and the force behind this event. She's very committed to Sudan, and she has two questions she sent me by email, and then we'll open it for everybody. One is to Ambassador Booth. She asked, you discussed the region and the involvement of countries that support the conflicting parties. Given that Sudan currently needs the support of international community, in your opinion, which countries can be relied upon to seriously mediate and seek the best interest of the Sudanese people and help resolve this war?
And that's an interesting question. Who can be the effective mediator? It has to be the mediator that the parties trust and will support to run a mediation or even a facilitation. And so far, there seems to be general agreement that the Jeddah process has been the best of many that have emerged, but that it needs to be expanded upon. And so that's probably where you start that discussion.
So in a sense, supporting the Jeddah process and expanding it to make. Second question she has is for Dr. Neda. Why, despite the crisis that Sudan is suffering from, which is considered one of the biggest humanitarian crises in the world, as you described as a catastrophe, and with all the situation you talked about, what is your explanation for the current international neglect? Do you have any sense of why? Dr. Neda?
I wish I did. So there was an article on in Foreign Policy, I believe, last week. It was an opinion piece, and the title of that was "Sudan is not a lost cause." And it actually talked about the fact that we characterize this conflict as catastrophic and beyond relief and beyond repair. And maybe that's a reason that, this attitude of the international community as this is a lost cause and the situation is futile and it's beyond repair. This kind of been the attitude. I've already talked about the competing priorities of the international community that could add to that as well. I think, Sudanese have been really grappling with this for the past year. Why is this not getting the attention of the international world? Several organizations have described this as the biggest catastrophe, humanitarian disaster in the world right now. But yet it doesn't seem to be on the top of the list. So people have been trying to make cases for the geopolitical factors that the international community needs to pay attention to. I think everyone knows about Russia's interest in the Red Sea. That should probably get some attention. The rise of terrorism in the country. We've all seen videos and pictures of Islamist terrorist group rising in the country, and that should probably get some attention. But I think really what should get attention is the Sudanese people themselves. The Sudanese people have worked really hard over the past decade to get to the point where they can actually get the rights of what they've been asking for the longest time: freedom, peace, and justice. Just simple human rights. And now that those rights that they were thought of as rights 4 years ago are now luxury. And all what people want today is food and security. They just want to be able to sleep without fearing for their survival while they're asleep. They just want to be able to not think about whether they're going to lose their children for hunger. The fourth factor I think that's contributed to this is lack of legitimate government in the country. There is right now governments by de facto everywhere, and those have not been really helpful or contributing to the solution. So I'll leave it at that, but I think those are just my scattered thought about this.
Thank you very much. Arish has a question for me, but I can talk to her separately about that. Let's open it for questions. I'll bring the first person that I saw. I'll bring the mic.
Thank you for giving me this chance. Ambassador, you mentioned that some people believe the military success is the ultimate solution to the domestic problem facing Sudan as it happened in Nigeria. But I wonder, do you think military success or force can be sufficient for settling the ethnic or religious diversity in the country? And today we're talking about Sudan's path forward. And so I wonder what would be the fundamental issue that has to be addressed in the long-term process of state building in Sudan? Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador.
Yeah, I touched on that. I mean, what you need is the political class to come up with some solution that would enable Sudanese to live together and embrace their diversity and live together in peace. Is that a federal system, a confederal system, a centralized system? What is that? And that, frankly, is going to be the major discussion, I think, during any transitional period, because they will have to finally come up with a constitution and address this fundamental flaw that has plagued Sudan since its independence and was really inherited from the colonial period. As I said, also, I don't think that a military solution, even if you have maybe a nominal victory by one side or the other, is really going to resolve things. because most likely, particularly if the Sudan Armed Forces were to prevail, I think you would have a return to what we saw in the past 30 years, which is the center of Sudan, a narrow group, a group which believes in political Islam trying to dominate the country, and the peripheral regions are not going to accept that. So they may be defeated temporarily, but there'll be uprisings. If the RSF were somehow to win, I think the big question there is what does that even look like? Because you could say, well, then Hemeti will become the ruler and he can decide how the transition will go forward. But as I said in my remarks, can he really control the troops he's mobilized? How do you take an army that basically is paid in part by looting and turn it into a force that supports the government? So again, I think you would have a lot of pushback from the former Bashir regime types, the Muslim Brothers, et cetera. Should there be an RSF victory, I think there would be a lust for revenge and setting scores straight, unfortunately.
I am Peter Humphrey, an intelligence analyst and a former diplomat. I think RSF victory is another Somalia, period. My question is twofold. One, can you help elucidate the rather odd position of Dubai with respect to Sudan? And two, is there anybody who is thinking about interdicting the gold flights from Haftar's territory in Chad out of Sudan? These flights are funding both sides, and there seems to be no good whatsoever to those flights. So where's the international will to interdict the flights? Shoot them down, force them to land, stick the gold into the treasury of the future Sudan.
Add to that the flights coming into Haftar from Russia with weapons that go straight to Sudan.
That's maybe the best bet.
Well, I think your question, comments reflect a bit what Hafed's also said. And I frankly take issue with the notion that the supporter of one side should be the one that gets the pressure. I think all of the parties that are supporting whichever side that's fighting should come under equal amounts of pressure. Otherwise, we're de facto taking a side in the civil war.
But I don't see the other side supporting anybody or being supported.
Oh, yes, they are. Oh, yes, they are, including by Iran. So let's not fool ourselves here. Both sides are able to fight this war because they have external support. So just focusing on one side's external support is taking sides in this war. And I think that when you say international community, what is the international community? If you're talking about the US and our European allies, there are a lot of other priorities that we have. And I think there's also, frankly, a bit of a resistance to get involved in the civil war other than on the side of civilians. And how do you best support the civilians? I think that's the question that really needs to be focused on more. I like the idea of what Fadi was saying of using some of the resources for resilience by investing them in civilian groups so that they get one, greater credibility on the ground, but also greater experience in governing and in providing governance services. This was one of the weaknesses of the transitional government. You had some smart people who were brought in as ministers, but they didn't have any capacity below them to then actually use the few resources that the transitional government had to provide services and to show the people of Sudan that we civilians truly can govern you for your benefit.
Let me just add on this. I don't know about Sudan, but in Libya, I can tell you factually that it was the support that came into Haftar from the UAE and Russia a year and a half before the Turks got involved on the other side. So it's also an issue of who started this process, which is no brain surgery that is going to trigger the other side getting the opposite support.
Again, I don't think that's the case in Sudan. I think both sides had support early on. And the Russians are an interesting, we clearly heard about the Wagner engagement with with Hemeti and the RSF. And certainly what I'm hearing is that some of that is continuing. That's kind of the business side of it. And yet, on the other hand, in the United Nations and other places, the Russian diplomatic support goes behind General Burhan and the SAF. So, if you support both sides, I guess you can't lose.
Well, I agree, and that's, I think, a very Russian thing to do. Please, I think the gentleman there has been waiting for a while.
Thank you. My name is Haitham Zaid, affiliated with American University. So I had a question actually for Dr. Nada, but I'm not sure if she's here. I guess if there's a way to reach out.
Yes,
to her
I'm
later.
sorry. I'm here. I just have my camera off.
Okay,
I'm moving
perfect.
through the
Thank you.
hospital.
Okay, and also a question for Fadul, but I think both are related to a certain extent. So Dr. Nada, you had talked about the community mobilization groups. I'm currently doing research in Sudan, and I've been talking a lot to emergency response rooms, which were to a certain extent offshoots of the Sudanese resistance committees that started around the revolution. And like you said, they've been very interesting outlet for I wouldn't say traditional aid, because they rely on what they call mutual aid, or in Arabic, nafir. And like you said, there are a lot of international actors that recognize that they're playing a role, but they're still struggling to find ways to work with them, just because it's hard to work through their systems to justify funding less traditional aid actors, giving budgets to groups that aren't registered, that don't have clear budget management systems, etc. From your experience, do you know of any examples of organizations or donors that have been able to overcome these internal obstacles in working with these, I guess, let's call them less conventional aid actors? Because as we know, the more traditional aid actors are restricted by warring parties. They don't have as much access to different parts of Sudan, and issues around worries about risk of their staff. And a very quick question for Dr. Fadi that relates to the nexus, the humanitarian development nexus. I think a big part of it is not just about how aid organizations are thinking of the nexus, or how implementing actors are thinking of the nexus, but rather how donors are thinking of the nexus. There's a keen separation between humanitarian and development funding, and not necessarily in the actions of agencies on the ground, but in the actions of donors. And even when we're thinking of coordination structures, there's a UN cluster system for humanitarian action, but there might not be an equivalent for development programming. In the Paris Convention, they were talking more about humanitarian, and there's the humanitarian response plan and financial track. Okay, I'm going to stop there because I feel like, but yeah, how can we pressure donors in bringing that nexus together?
Thank you very much. It's just I just looked at the watch, and I think we're almost at the end. I mean, we are at the end. So after your question, I think there is only one question that I remember, and that's from Paul, right? And then we'll conclude. Is that okay with you? A few more minutes. Okay. Dr. Nada, and then Fadi, please, if you want to respond to the question.
Sure, I'll offer a quick response. So I think the situation is much better now when it comes to utilizing the ERRs in a meaningful way, the emergency response rooms, which is, most of them used to be resistance committees. So OCHA now has an ERR forum that they convene on a monthly basis, where they bring ERRs and link them with humanitarian actors. And there is examples of actors who have figured this out, such as the Danish Refugee Commission and NRCs and others, who have been able to actually effectively work with these ERRs and overcome the bureaucracy and the big administrative burden that has hindered their operation in the past. So, I mean, you have to kind of think outside of the box, honestly, to be able to utilize them effectively. But thank you, that's an amazing question. I'm happy to talk later too. If you want, we can share my email and communicate.
Share the doctor's email to Lana. Fadi, you have a comment on this?
On the second part of the question, how do you convince donors of the nexus? It's been very frustrating because the donors push the UN agencies to work together, but then themselves as donors, as governments, they're siloed in how they provide their information. But one example that I would like to give is the Iraq reconstruction after the war on ISIL. I mean, the US stepped up and partnered with UNDP to have that immediate return of people to their homes, reconstruct services, so on and so forth. So to me, at heart, it's a political decision by the donors. If they really want to push for that, I don't think bureaucracy would be the hurdle. I think the key element is a political decision to say this is what we want to do and get it done. It's not what they have. We will manage to do it if the political decision is.
Thank you. I guess Paul, and then we'll conclude.
I'm Paul Sutton, former diplomat and working now for Global Insights Group. Quick question. The United States has been a bit stepped back from this crisis over the course of it. What more can the United States do and what more should it do? And especially like your thoughts on the appointment of a new special envoy and what he's been engaged in so far.
Thanks, Paul. I think really the US has been engaged in this all along. I mean, we were the ones who worked with the Saudis to get the Jeddah process up and running. That was done within weeks of the outbreak of the conflict last April. And we've continued to push that process. We've also been working with others, the African Union, IGAD, the Organization for the Horn of Africa, Egypt and others who have all put forward different approaches to try to facilitate negotiations between the parties. So I think we have been engaged.
At a lower level though than in the past.
Well, so we didn't have a special envoy for a while. Now we do. I think that was a good decision. And I think the Special Envoy Perriello has gone out with a lot of energy, meeting with Sudanese, because after all, this is about Sudan, meeting particularly with women and youth groups. Not so far, as I understand, really engaging with the warring parties, but also engaging the region. And as I said in my remarks, I think that's the critical thing, is you've got to get the key regional players to sit down and have an honest discussion about what are your interests and how can we reconcile your interests with the other party's interests, I think there probably is a Venn diagram that can be drawn. It will not be easy, and it will take some pressure, and will probably take higher level political engagement, which frankly in the US in an election year is going to be difficult to muster. You know, I think, as I said, famine is in no one's interest. And if that hits the headlines, then I think you will see that greater engagement. But let's hope it doesn't have to come to that. Let's hope that having a special envoy dedicated full-time to trying to bring regional interests together so that then that external support can begin to dry up for both sides of the conflict and the pressures can build from the outside on both sides, both the RSF and the SAF, can begin to push forward. I also agree with the idea of focusing initially, as I said, on the humanitarian assistance side rather than the ceasefire negotiations. I think they're much more fraught because then they get into what's the political future, what's the transition government look like. And this has to be taken in manageable bites. You can't eat the elephant in one bite.
Thank you all very, very much. We ran a few minutes late, so my apologies to our guests. But I'm grateful to all of you for being here. We'll have more and more discussions on Sudan and that part of the world because it is already in a mess, and I expect it to get worse over the next few months and even a year. I don't think things are pointing upward. Anyway, thank you, Ambassador. Thank you, Dr. Nada and Fadi. Appreciate your joining us, and have a great day.
Thank you so much for having us.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.